And we say, oh God, here in the Northeast, it's a spectacularly beautiful day. And we're enjoying it and celebrating it. But we also know that there are places in the world, especially in Gaza and Ukraine and Sudan and Yemen, where no matter how beautiful the day, life is full of violence, terror, and confusion. And we ask for the courage as friars to accept the world as it is, to enter into it as it is, so that God can use us to be a transforming presence in the world everywhere. And so we ask you, strengthen us on this journey, free us from fear, lift our hearts into your heart, and show us the way to fullness of life, especially on this Franciscan path. And I just want to pause for a few moments if you have special intentions. You don't have to speak them aloud. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, Dave, if you'd pull up that PowerPoint, that would be helpful. So I wish I could take full credit for this, but Father David really put the PowerPoint together. I just sent him the stuff. So thank you for that, Dave. But I also want to begin with saying thank you to Father Dave for last week. He offered us an insight last week that's hugely important in my judgment for the 21st century. And that is that he kept insisting that death is normal and necessary. And it implies that suffering is a part of everyone's life. Many people have tried to help us understand this, but today what we're going to do is celebrate the genius of Francis, which was, I want to suggest, an affective genius. Francis wasn't terribly interested with insight of the mind. That doesn't mean he didn't have it. His genius, though, was a kind of affective genius. And he knew from his own experience, I tried to talk about this a little bit 2 weeks ago, that suffering was necessary and normal. And although it would fill us with fear, it was something that eventually, if we committed our whole lives to God, would set us free on a new path of hope. But that the fear never completely goes. And so I spoke about it, Father David spoke about it, that most commentators today talk about Francis having post-traumatic stress. I know it's a 21st century notion, but it's one that fits well into Francis's life. And there's a little book, you'll find a reference to it at the end of this PowerPoint.
So how do I make the screen bigger?
You don't have to be writing it down. But this is a little book that I find especially helpful. It's called, and some of you may know it, Riding the Dragon by Robert Wicks, who, like Father David, is a trained psychologist and spiritual director. And his books are very accessible. I'm speaking about this one today because, very honestly, I've read it several times. It's the kind of book that you can read a page or three and stop and just reflect about it. But the key insight of Wicks's book, Riding the Dragon, is this. He says, first of all, in the Christian West, we think of the dragon as somebody overwhelming and frightening. And so the dragon is someone that we try to tame, control, and manage. And most people who've had the opportunity to enter into psychological therapy have been helped in this regard by their therapist. So how are we going to manage all the stuff that goes on in all of our lives? The death of a beloved person, the breaking down of a friendship, the failure of our children and children's children to celebrate our faith tradition at all. In fact, even resist it. How are we going to do that? And so in Riding the Dragon, he talks about in the Christian West, we try to manage all of that. Okay, I can do this, I can do that. But what he points out, and I think this is also the genius of Francis, in the East, in Asia especially, they speak of riding the dragon because the dragon, although frightening and big, is a friend, someone who comes to defend us. And if you look online, you're going to find hundreds, even thousands of images of children riding dragons. And that was the fundamental insight, I think, that Father Dave presented us last week, that St. Francis was afraid of death. But he didn't just try to manage it. He talked about death as something that could lead us into joy. This was true for Francis's entire life. And as we've pointed out before, part of it was the loss of a relationship with his father in an ongoing way. But also near the end of his life, and that's what we've been focusing on for a little bit here, the loss of the friars as he thought they needed to be. Now, sometimes we get lost in this because we see Francis obviously upset in the biographies written about him that the friars are moving away from poverty. And my conviction is that Francis is not so concerned about the friars moving away from poverty, but moving away from the poor, which is very different. And so he knew in the early days of his conversion that kissing the leper was not enough. He had to go day after day and wash their wounds, because it's only over time that we begin to realize that the lepers are fully human. You may not be familiar with this, and there's no literature that demonstrates Francis actually knew it, but we have written evidence of a mass for the dead. And so in the early part of a new year, the mayor of a town, perhaps even in Assisi, and a physician would examine the skin of all people who were afraid they had leprosy. And if they were determined to have leprosy, this is an awful image, but it's important for us to understand it, they would be told to lie face down on the ground. They would be covered in a black cloth, and the mass for the dead would be said for them. And after the mass, they were no longer considered human persons. They were things that could be used. They were allowed to come into villages at night to clean, but they were no longer human because they had died even in our faith. I think Francis knew this. And I think that was his great fear. And I think what God gave him was the freedom to enter into this over and over again, into the death of those who were considered lepers, people who were pushed out of the society, pushed to the edge. And it's this that he was afraid. The friars, as they moved into the 13th century, were moving away from the relationship with the poor. The relationship and the poor are symbolized in lepers. But anybody who was on the underside of any society. So Robert Wicks suggests that we need to learn how to ride the dragon. And I want to suggest that St. Francis learned how to ride the dragon by riding his fear into a new relationship with those who had been condemned to non-personhood, and who he embraced with love and with hope. Within 100 years of St. Francis's death, there is no evidence that the Mass for the dead for lepers was ever celebrated again. I can't prove to you historically that Francis was the root of this, but I do want to suggest all of the poverty movements in Western Europe led us to realize that we need to have relationships, active relationships with those from the underside of every society. And so Franciscans are naturally inclined, and it's necessary for them to enter into that suffering. The Capuchin Franciscans, I think, at least theoretically, do this well. And one of the things they remind us, you can do the next screen, Dave. One of the things they remind us of really powerfully is that there is no such thing as a Franciscan person unless that person is fully immersed in Christ, fully immersed in St. Francis, fully immersed in the Franciscan life, and fully immersed in the church. So the constitutions of the Capuchins begin that way. Everything begins with a gospel text. From that gospel text, they help us understand how Francis interpreted that. And from how Francis interpreted how it became enshrined in Franciscan law. And then how it was approved by the church. This is a critical kind of thing for us to understand, because if we don't understand this, then we're going to become a cult that loves the poor. And we love the poor. We love lepers because they're the face of Christ. And they are the community to which every Catholic Christian is called to go and to embrace. In our society, they may be considered a dragon, someone to fear, someone to avoid, someone to run away from. In the Franciscan tradition, with Francis's example, we embrace the dragon. We embrace the poor. We embrace lepers. In order to understand this, I think, a little bit better, and Father David is much more familiar with this theory than I am, and I'm sure he's developed it in many ways, but I first learned the distinction that I want to offer you for today between transactional and transformational relationships in family systems therapy. Now, Father David has written extensively about this. But this distinction between the transactional and the transformational actually began in leadership theory. And one of the things that was often written about was leaders are transactional leaders when the only thing they want from their employees or those who are under them hierarchically is production. And that's what you're rewarded for. This is absolutely counterintuitive to what Francis is and to what Franciscans are. We are not in relationship with the poor in order to be transactionally successful. But it was a fellow named James McGregor Burns who in the late 70s began to write about transactional and inspirational leadership. And then in family systems therapy, transactional and transformative. Let me give you a simple example of this. I happen to be privileged to work with a group of men in group spiritual direction, all of whom are married. And I remember so well one of them saying, you know, when a marriage gets reduced to transactional behavior, it's empty. So my wife calls and says, don't forget to pick up milk on the way home, or Billy's at soccer practice, I can't get him, you should. These are transactional things, and there's nothing wrong with transactional behaviors in every lifestyle. Father David and anybody who's lived in community knows this. If the kitchen is a mess or the dining room is a mess, and somebody has left it a mess and it's another friar, there's a little bit of annoyance. But we can't reduce Franciscan life, the common life, the consecrated life, to transactional behaviors. And that's what I think St. Francis was so concerned with in the early community of friars around the year, just before, in the last years before his death. And so he plunges into this idea. And what I want to suggest, because it's the foundation of the rest of this talk, is that true joy that St. Francis talks about. Now, I'm assuming that 98% of us are Franciscans, and we know the story from the Fioretti, the little flowers of St. Francis, about true joy, and it can be confounding and confusing. But what he's suggesting is that true joy cannot emerge from purely transactional lifestyle and behaviors. But that's where I want to take a deep breath with you, because that's what does happen in most marriages, in most families, in most religious communities. And I ask for your discernment about this, because I don't know this firsthand, but I hear about this happening all of the time in secular Franciscan fraternities. So folks get together, talk about a part of their rule, have a reflection about it, and nothing changes. It's only when transactional behaviors transform us that we have the freedom to become the person God needs us to be in the world. We are not a cult. We are a community of sisters and brothers who are trying to live the gospel in the spirit of St. Francis. And I was fascinated this week. We celebrated the feast of St. Anthony. And in the office of readings, there was this great line. Somehow, I'm sure I read it 100 times, but I hadn't heard it before. St. Anthony says, when you teach, use words. When you preach, use actions. And so our preaching has to be about our relationship with one another. We all know the wonderful story of the young friar who kept saying to St. Francis, Father Francis, you promised that you and I would go on a preaching mission together, and we never have had the opportunity. And Francis says to him, okay, tonight's the day. Tonight's the night. We're going to go on a preaching mission. And they're walking, and they're very pleasant with one another as they walk through the town of Assisi. And all of a sudden, they're at the back gate. And the young fellow says to him, Father Francis, You said we were going to go on a preaching mission today. And Francis says to him, we just did. By their listening presence to one another, by their sensitivity to one another, by their by their compassion for one another, and by their listening presence, they preached. So too can we. I think that young fellow got transformed by Francis's message. What they were doing was transactional, but it led them into transformation. So keep that distinction in the back of your mind as we go further now, because what Father David opened up a powerful and frightening door last week. I want to put a door stopper inside of it so that it stays open. Because what he suggested is what I'm going to try and demonstrate. That when Francis speaks about perfect joy, he's offering an interpretation of the Gospels that we often ignore or say almost in a softer voice. So, Dave, if you do the next screen, please. Well, I skipped that one, so it's the next one even. Perfect. That's it. Thanks so much. So we know that in Matthew's Gospel, in the 5th chapter, we read what are considered the Beatitudes of Jesus. Some would even say the essence of Jesus, or the commandments of Jesus. That may be going too far, but you get the idea. And in the 11th and 12th verse of chapter 5, Jesus writes, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you." In this simple, powerful, frightening text, Francis asks all Franciscans to be prophets. We are in the prophetic tradition because we continue to speak the truth of the gospel, whether anyone listens or not. I don't think this happened to Father David, but some of his maybe not even his classmates, but from his cohort in the seminary, we used to send people here in the Northeast to work at the Catholic Worker with Dorothy Day. She was still alive in those days. And she lived this particular beatitude in a powerful way, if you know her life story. But she would get all volunteers who would come to her for the summer, especially seminarians, and she would sit them down, and they would have to listen to her say, "If you've come to the Catholic Worker because you want to eliminate poverty in New York City, you should go home. We are here to feed the hungry because Jesus told us to do this. We want to be faithful, not successful. If we're successful, that's good too, but we want to be faithful to the gospel." And so Francis is telling us, as we read the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, do you want to be faithful to this terribly demanding text? Blessed are you, beloved are you, happy are you. All of those are good translations for the Greek. When people insult you and persecute and falsely say all kinds of evil and against you because of me, can you imagine that? What Jesus is saying to the apostles, Francis is saying to us, you have to ride this dragon. Jesus is the song of God.
I love that.
The music of his life can fill us with hope, even when no one listens, or when we fail to be successful in the world. Remember, transactional leadership is trying to lead us into being successful. Transformational leadership is trying to lead us, in my judgment, into the gospel. And for us, into the gospel in a Franciscan way. Dave, would you put up that next screen now too? So we read this again, not just in the Gospel of Matthew, but in the first letter of Peter. He writes, beloved, do not be surprised by the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings. Can you do that? Can I do that? I think it's the most difficult challenge in the scriptures and in the gospels, that you may also rejoice and be glad when God's glory is revealed. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. So this is one of the reasons why my first presentation, I suggested to you that the book, The Saint and the Sultan, was a powerful book that will help us understand not just the gospel, but Francis's understanding of true joy. Okay, we can move up to the next screen, Dave. So here's something that I think we don't spend enough time on in the Franciscan tradition. So most of us are charmed by the Fioretti, even though we know it may not be historically accurate. For me, these stories contain the heart of what it means to be a Franciscan. So while we can't demonstrate it in that same way that we can demonstrate other sources of Francis, the Fioretti offer us stories about the Franciscan vision and hope that can move us. And we'll get into this in a little bit, the fullness of it, but you remember the story of perfect joy. So Francis is walking with Leo, and Leo says, you got to tell me what this means. What's perfect joy about? And then Francis says to him, and they're beautiful. These are really beautiful. Dave, if you've moved to that next screen. So he says, so Leo, I've got to move this thing a little bit. There we go. All right. I hope. Maybe not. Anyhow, Francis says to him, and this is important. So if the friars minor to make the lame walk, if they should make straight the crooked, chase away demons, give sight to the blind, hear the deaf, speech to the dumb, that would not be perfect joy. But don't get lost here. It's joyful. Everyday life as a Franciscan can be joyful. For Francis, it's, and in Bonaventure's Legenda Maya, this is over and over again. He talks about this. Francis felt great joy in all creation. Francis felt great joy in being able to ride the dragon of leprosy. Francis felt great joy when people came to live with him and to share his life. Francis felt great joy when the church approved his rule. So that we're not always knowing perfect joy does not mean we shouldn't be joyful. And most of us are Franciscans on here, so think of the day you were welcomed into the fraternity. It's hard for me to admit this out loud right now, But my 63rd anniversary of welcome into the novitiate is only a couple months away. And the joy I felt when people put the Franciscan robe on me was beyond anything I could have hoped for. Was it pure? Of course not. I was a kid. But I knew that God had put into my heart something that would change me eventually and change all those who met me in faith. But it would be God's work of transformation, not mine. So I was just 18 years old. I was in the novitiate. I didn't realize that I wasn't supposed to be walking around in front of the building. The novice master had not made that clear yet of the novitiate. And a car came in and there was a woman in it. And she stopped and said, "Father, would you have a moment to chat with me?" And I said, "Well, I'm only a novice. I just got here. But if you ring the doorbell, you'll find a priest." But I said to myself, this is an incredibly powerful sign, an invitation. And there was joy in the thought that soon ministerial love for all those most in need would emerge from my heart, and that people would respond as best they could with joy. Francis goes on and on about this. And Bonaventure, I'm sure you realize this in the Legenda Maior, talks about joy after joy. So God speaks to Francis from the cross. Francis is overwhelmed. He frees Francis to be a pilgrim without anything of his own. And he lets him find joy in all of creation. You might remember this, and because it's powerful. But Bernard of Quintavalle was his first follower. And for Francis, that someone like Bernard, who was a wealthy businessman like his father, would choose to follow this Franciscan path, filled him with overwhelming joy. And so Bernard says to Francis, "So how are we going to know what to do? I know that what you're saying is a way to live the Beatitudes, but what's this going to mean specifically?" So he said, "Let's go ask God." And they open the Bible 3 times and they get the message that's the core of the Franciscan path. And I hope that all of you have received it and are experiencing some renewal in it as the years go on. I know I've spoken to Father David about this and many friars. And for all of you who are on a Franciscan path, we don't always live the fullness of the Franciscan way. We get hurt. We get confused. We sometimes even wonder whether this is insane. But I want to say to you today, after 63 years of trying to do this, I'm immensely grateful. God has given me and you a great vocation, a great call. And God keeps planting seeds. You know the parable of the sower, right? Mm-hmm. Some seed that God plants in us bounces off because our hearts are too hard. Some lands among thorns and gets choked. Some gets us excited and grows up right away, but it has no depth. And God keeps trying. And finally, God finds a part of our heart and life that's good ground, and it produces fruit for 100 or 60 or 40-fold. Francis knew this joy. that God found in him and in the early friars. And then powerfully in St. Clare and her sisters found. And Francis is overwhelmed with joy. I hope you're hearing me today. The only way Francis was going to die joyful is if he lived joyfully. And so he had to find a way to be transformed by the gospel, which reminded him that it would only be by his rejection, by his own family, by the people of Assisi, by the Sultan. It was only by that he would plunge into the God who hung upon a cross for us and be totally transformed by him. And the gift of the stigmata comes to him at that time, in those last years. It was painful, physically painful. It added to the pain of his stomach. David talked about this last, he didn't have Tums or Rolaids or anything that you might take. Prilosec, he didn't have that. His stomach was upset all the time. He must have had unbearable headaches because of his eyes and any light. And then he begins to realize that the friars are breaking into little groups under the title of Lady Poverty. In my own doctoral work, David might be one of the only people in the world who ever read that, my doctoral work. But I dealt with a little book in the Franciscan tradition called the Sacrum Commercium. And it's about Francis trying to find Lady Poverty all over the place. And finally, he finds Lady Poverty clinging to Francis on the cross and says, "Oh, my Lord, this is the only way I will be completely devoid of everything. If my arms are stretched out next to Jesus's, if my heart bleeds for the world like his did, and I can only trust that as, this is hard to say, the friars plunged into his heart, blood and water would flow out, which the early church believed was the beginning of the church." So water, a sign of baptism, blood, a sign of the Eucharist. It came from the side of Jesus on the cross. And if we want to understand perfect joy, the only way we're ever going to be able to do this is to ask God to help us be unafraid of the suffering that comes to us because we're prepared to live the gospel in its fullness. And to speak it and live it, this is hard for North Americans, not just individually, but structurally. I've been studying a lot recently, and Father David has led me into this many times. The social encyclicals of the church, which I'm not on, I feel very confident in saying have been largely ignored in the North American church because we're such an individualistic society and we have reduced gospel life. But if you read Rerum Novarum at the end of the 19th century, Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years later, and right after the First World War, you go to Pacem in Terris with Paul VI. You go to, and especially John Paul II, in Solicitudo Rei Socialis. And what they're always saying, and Pope Francis is exploding with this, saying it's not enough to live the gospel individually. We have to do it as a community of faith, and we will be rejected for this. It will bring us suffering because our job is to witness that the poor all poor. Black, Muslim, Jew, gay, lesbian, queer, whatever, are God's holy people. And too many people in our society don't want to hear it. But we know it because we've lived it in the Franciscan life. That's the gift of the struggles inside community. I hope this is making sense to you, because it's the fullness, in my judgment, of the beauty of Francis of Assisi, especially in his last years. And I know I have to stop soon, David, and I will, because 45, 50 minutes is a long time to listen. But I do want to take just a moment to go into that last piece. I've skipped some stuff. You'll find it from G.K. Chesterton. You know, one of the great lines in Chesterton's line about the life of St. Francis is cryptic and beautiful. He said, St. Francis saw himself as in debt to all people and all creation. And when you're in debt to somebody and somebody's not beating you up with that, the only thing you can do is be full of joy and gratitude. And so Francis is begging God for the grace to be full of joy and gratitude, even though he never reconciled with his father, and even though the friars were becoming a mess in the world and fighting with each other in public ways and trying to influence the path of the Franciscan way because it was something that satisfied them. And Francis says, get back to the basics. Fall in love with a poor person. If you pay attention to Pope Francis, you'll say, do you want to know the fullness of the gospel? Fall in love with a poor person. I've had the opportunity, Father David has had the opportunity, many of you have had the opportunity to fall in love with poor people all over the world, literally. And I just want to tell one quick story of joy for me, because I realized it was so tender. I was in Central America, in Honduras. I was visiting with another friar, a family in a campo, and Brother Juancho, who was a student of mine, had said to me, they have 4 children and they just had twins. So it's dusk and it'll be hard to see. Well, we got to the place. They were so relieved it was us because they thought it was the Contras during the early days of the Sandinista in Nicaragua. And they welcomed us with great joy. And I looked around in the haze and realized there were 3 other children. And I said in broken Spanish, Padre Juancho told me that you had 4 children. She said, oh, yes, well, my sister died in a bus crash. And so we have 3 new beautiful children in a space, maybe 14 by 15 total. And she said, Father, what's your name? And I said, Juan. And she said, oh, one of the babies, the new twins, is Juan. And she gives me the baby. And they don't wear diapers in Honduras. And that baby did what babies do. All over me. And she covered her mouth and looked at me with great joy and said, finally, you've been baptized. Before God, I was. I realized that this woman and her husband, who was a delegado de las palabras, embraced and rode the dragon. They accepted with joy 3 extra children who they couldn't possibly feed easily because God had given to them those children to them in a terrible experience of loss. And so Francis is saying to us with perfect joy, if you can embrace the dragon, then, and I'm only going to read the last part of Francis's piece here. You ready for this, right? I'll do it quickly because I want to end. Leo says to Francis, I pray you'll teach me about perfect joy. Francis answered, if we arrive at the Porziuncola, remember, the first place that they built, and if we're drenched with rain and trembling with cold, covered in mud and exhausted from hunger, and if we knock on the convent gate, and if we're not recognized by the porter, and if he tells us that we're impostors who seek to deceive the world and steal from the poor, and if he refuses to open the gate, and if he leaves us outside exposed in rain and snow, suffering from cold and hunger, then if we embrace the injustice, cruelty, I suggest, ride the dragon, that the porter knew us, but was told by God to reject us, then, dear brother Leo, write down and note carefully, this is perfect joy. And he goes on and says, and if it happens again, it's perfect joy. If we only read that as young people, I don't think we'll ever get it. It's like, how can this, what are you talking about? And Francis was talking about his life and gospel life and how to live the Beatitudes and how to live what First Peter tells us, to be grateful and full of joy when we're nailed to the cross with Christ for the sake of God's reign. We have been invited to live a beautiful life. And so with Francis at his death, I say to all of us, sisters and brothers, let us begin. For up to now, we've done nothing. So the questions, Dave, if you go all the way to the end, once again, I forgot to put them there. So I'll repeat them and I'll put them in the chat, but it's very simple. How do you understand perfect joy? And have you ever experienced perfect joy? Because you're trying to live the gospel and you're trying to be a Franciscan living the gospel.